So there are basically three types of elections at which media coverage of the EU may matter. Obviously, it's the election for the European Parliament itself, held every 5 years. Then we have seen a series of referenda across the continent on various aspects of European integration, treaties, membership, the currency, etc. And then we have national or general elections. And in each of these elections, news coverage of the EU may potentially have an impact on voting behavior. And just as well as it's important to distinguish the different types of elections because they have different dynamics vis-a-vis the coverage, it's also important, I think, to disentangle a little bit the idea of what electoral behaviour is meant here. On the one hand, there's of course electoral behaviour in the sense of turnout, mobilization and actual engagement at the elections. And secondly, you have electoral behavior in the sense of actual vote choice, whether it be voting for a party or voting to endorse or against a referendum issue. And a couple of remarks for each of these different types of elections and these different types of activities, either turnout or vote choice. So if we look at the research which has come out in the past about 15 years, it is not the case that there's a one-on-one relationship across the continent with countries that have higher degrees of news coverage of the EU and turnout. So that's not the case. However, there is a relationship, and we do see that in those countries where there's generally more news, there's also is a stronger incentive to turn out. And mind you, there's a vast difference in what we consider when we talk about the coverage of the EU. Britain has its own peculiarities in terms of coverage, but if we look at the coverage of European parliamentary elections, we've seen election campaigns where as little as just 2 news stories in an evening news in the lead up to the elections were making reference to these elections, and up to other campaigns in other countries where up to a third of the evening news in the run up to these elections were about the European parliamentary elections. So there's a vast variety and difference, in fact, in what it is we're talking about when we are considering the coverage of the EU. So what has some of that research shown? That has shown that especially in those countries where the news is conflict-driven, so where there's a lot of room for the differences of opinion, that can actually have a mobilizing effect on the electorate, in particular in countries where the EU has been a relative consensus topic. I know that's hard to imagine in a place like this, but there are many countries that at least up to 2009, you'd say that by and large the EU was a consensus topic. Most political parties agreed on the fact that European integration was a good thing, and there was not a variety of opinions on the supply side. In those countries where nonetheless news coverage actually did point to these differences of opinion that might be there but not yet part of mainstream, if citizens were exposed to this type of coverage, it actually had a positive impact on turnout. So that's an important, I think, first lesson to learn from the media impact on electoral behavior, that conflict is actually a good thing, especially in those countries where the EU topic had been somewhat of a consensus issue. In referenda, that has also been the case. That's of course a different dynamic, and here typically media and especially broadcasters run into all kinds of challenges in terms of determining the type of attention that they give to different parties in a referendum. Is balance, is that 50-50 because of the yes-no nature, or is balance 80-20 due to some reflection of what might be the voices of opinion in national parliament? These are all things that come into play if we look at the coverage of referenda. There have been held quite a few. Interestingly, I think that very little has been learned collectively from these referenda. At least everybody who starts a new referendum campaign starts with the same mistakes as the previous times. So little has been learned from Ireland, from Sweden, from Denmark, from France, from the Netherlands, where referenda have been held and have failed miserably. But this is obviously something that we can maybe come back to also in the Q&A. The second type of electoral behavior is, of course, the actual vote choice, which can be a yes or a no vote in the referendum context. And there is something that might be important to know from the extant research that has a relationship with one of the introductory remarks of the EU being seen as a topic which is relatively complex, at least in the eyes of many citizens and journalists. So one of the outcomes from previous research has been that even in a context where, for example, a treaty which is being voted on might get relatively positive news coverage, that would still mobilize skeptics more to go to the poll. So that's a bit of a hard twist, but that news that is relatively positive about these treaties themselves might, by the mere fact of them being in the news, still send a mobilizing message to the ones that are skeptics or latent skeptics towards these treaties to actually turn out and vote. If we look at voting behavior at the European Parliament, there has been some research suggesting that especially news coverage that point to some of the economic benefits that the EU has had in various places, that is something that can mitigate otherwise in a situation where Eurosceptic parties might be faring well, but that there's actually been a pinpointed effect from news coverage that has this focus on the economic consequences and the potential economic benefits of membership to the EU, and that is something that can mitigate an otherwise strong-standing Eurosceptic vote. So those are some of the insights from existing research that I wanted to point to. A lot of things have obviously changed since 2008-9. The crisis, first the economic crisis and later now the refugee crisis, I think has also blurred completely the often thought about boundary between what is EU news and what is domestic political news. In much of the extant literature and research, there's always been a challenge in trying to pinpoint how much EU news is there, and is that sufficient to have something of a European public sphere? Most likely not. But then there are different degrees to which you can have a Europeanized national public sphere. Well, I think one of the things, and research is only now coming out from the past years, that has really blurred over the past years is that the EU topic has become completely intermingled with the domestic political agenda in several countries across the continent and here. What has happened at the same time is that the EU has probably also come to matter much more in domestic political arenas. So the third type of elections that I mentioned at the outset, in addition to the European Parliament elections and the referenda, are the general elections. And there's been some pointers throughout the 1990s and 2000s that under certain circumstances, EU topics might actually surface in national elections and be an impetus for the vote choice. Well, the research that will come out based on national elections in Hungary and Greece, obviously Spain, over the last years will show that the EU has now become a mainstream topic also in the national political arena. And then two final changes before I close, which are important, I think, when discussing the impact of the media vis-a-vis electoral behavior, is that what we consider the media, much of the research still is really looking at the importance of television and newspapers, and much of that research has taken a starting point is in the EU being something relatively distant, and the traditional media playing a key role in trying to bridge the gap between citizens and politics, especially in the realm of the EU, where few have direct and personal experiences. But with the advent of social media, there's a whole new ballgame also with regard to EU reporting. I think the jury is still out as to what the role of social media is when it comes to the matter of the EU. Some of the early studies suggest that little is done in social media more than referring to already institutionalized media sources, but I think this is just preliminary research coming out. And the very final mark to point to when looking at the relationship between media and electoral behavior is that if we've seen one thing in the past years with electorates across Europe, it is that there's been an increased volatility, so that in many countries the degree of citizens that actually will vote for the same party in 2 or more consecutive elections has decreased, and that opens potentially for a larger degree of effects of this type of news coverage in a situation where more members of the electorate wander between parties from one election to another. This is obviously something that is more pronounced in countries that have real multi-party system with 10 plus members or parties represented in parliament, but also something that we have seen in countries with only fewer parties. So with those observations, I'll stay within the 10 minutes, I hope.
I think it's important to ask a few questions. What is it exactly that we're talking about when we ask about public opinion about the EU? Are we simply talking about support for the EU? preferences on the referenda? Are we talking about engagement with and knowledge about the workings of the European Union and about, and about the various different particular implications of a UK in or out of the EU? And we could also be talking about how the issue of the EU influences evaluations of performance of the political parties or of approval of political party leaders. So there's various dimensions when we talk about the EU and public opinion. It's not simply whether or not the media influence support, because I think, as Claes suggested, it's very difficult to find evidence that the EU or coverage of the EU has a direct impact on whether or not people support the EU. Another question I think that it's important to ask is, well, what is the mechanism by which media coverage might influence opinion? And I think it's important to understand here that the nature of how individuals are exposed to the news media has changed dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. The traditional media still play an important role, but the ways in which individuals are now exposed to that traditional media is much different. And I think we're in an environment where individuals can be much more selective about the types of news that they are exposed to. And then there is also the element of social media, which we should pay attention to. Though, again, I agree with Claes that there's not a lot of evidence as to its impact. And so we need to take that into consideration. We also need to take into consideration, particularly in the UK, that the type of press system is still partisan. And so we always want to ask what is the method by which individuals are exposed to the different stories, and then what is the process by which that might influence opinion. And one of the other observations I'd like to make is that generally what we have understood to be the nature of news media coverage of the EU is that, as Claes mentioned, in European parliamentary elections, up until quite recently, there had been little attention paid to the EU. And we generally thought that this meant a lack of understanding about the EU and its processes, and hence a lack of support. But that no longer is the case. And we found, actually, and I'll get to these data in a minute, we found a different story in terms of when we looked at the general election news coverage and how the EU was represented in that news coverage. Another observation that's made about the news media coverage is that it does tend to be negative, and that leads to a lack of support for the EU. However, here I think we need to ask, well, negative relative to what? When I looked at news coverage of the European parliamentary elections in the UK, yes, it was negative about the EU on balance, but it was much more negative about national politicians and national politics than it was about the EU. So in terms of the relative negativity of it, it's no more negative than about national politics. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well. And again, is that there may be an indirect influence of news media on opinion. It may filter through to leadership evaluations. It may form a component of how people come to evaluate the national performance of the government. And this may be actually linked to the amount and tone of news coverage about politics. Still, there is greater attention paid to the EU in the news, but the question, I think, then becomes, with all of these competing factual claims about the implications of the EU, it's very difficult for citizens to judge or make judgments based on these competing claims about which are factually correct and which are not. And in a sense, then, still voters and citizens rely on predispositions and partisan cues in these situations to filter through the information. And again, that's another reason why news media may not have a direct effect on support. And hence we need to pay attention to other outcomes which it may be influencing. Well, this is my fourth observation. It's very difficult to get at, as I suggested, the direct impact of the media on public opinion, and why it actually may have a minimal influence on opinion is because individuals select news to be exposed to which tends to be consistent with predispositions, or they read a newspaper which is consistent with their opinions, or they share stories, or they have friends who share stories with them that are consistent with their own opinions. And this method of selective exposure, or this process of selective exposure, which is much easier in an environment with social media, with Web 2.0, where most of us do not open up a newspaper in the morning and read from front to back. We may encounter newspaper stories, but increasingly they're newspaper stories that are shared through Twitter feeds or Facebook feeds, and we're exposed to those traditional press stories in a different way. And that sharing and resharing, again, allows us to be more selective about the information, and we're sharing information which is, again, consistent with our predispositions or our preferences. And so what tends to happen is that there's a narrowing of a range of opinions to which we're exposed to, rather than opening up the wide diversity of positions and claims that are being made about the EU. So again, in that sense, it may be reinforcing tendencies or preferences or opinions that are held by the public, rather than exposing us to the wide range of opinions that are out there, informing us and allowing us then to choose a position based on a full understanding of the EU and the UK's relationship to the EU. So for that reason, I think it's good to question and to say, well, what are the impacts when we're operating in that sort of environment. So to move on then to a project that I'm involved with that gathered news media coverage and data on news media coverage, both traditional and social media, around the 2015 general election. What we did was gather both traditional news media sources, both national, regional press, television, radio, social media, blogs, and Twitter. We gathered all of that information for actually the 3 months leading up to the general election to assess a lot of different aspects of the campaign, the coverage, and its influence on preferences and mobilization. But what we found in terms of the EU is that when we looked at all of the news, this is just data on press, we looked at over 400,000 stories. Of course, we used computer-assisted coding of these stories because by some estimates it would take us 4 years to read that many stories. So we did use a machine learning to look at the stories. The EU was one of the top 5 issues covered in the campaign, along with the NHS and the economy. So the news media were paying attention to it. It was, of course, made a campaign issue by the Conservatives and the referendum. We did see a marked increase in the attention paid to the EU right after the election, of course, when the promise of the referendum was followed up. So it was an issue. We haven't yet looked at the role that it played in preferences, but there are claims made that it did bring potential UKIP voters back to the Conservatives. So that bears further investigation. We do know that the coverage of it and in the news stories in terms of sentiments, whether negative or positive, that the EU overall, when linked to Cameron, it was, if you looked on average at all newspapers together, it tended to be a more negative sentiment for stories that were talking about the EU and Cameron together. on balance relative to Miliband. So there was this negative association between the EU and Cameron. However, when we look at whether or not that actually had an impact on leadership evaluations of Cameron, it did not. He was fairly resilient to any sort of negative sentiment in these news stories. We have, based on those data that we've collected, all of the traditional and social media surrounding the general election campaign, we are going to continue collecting data. We've continued to collect the data, and we'll collect that through the EU referendum. So we'll be able to look at the same aspects of coverage surrounding the EU referendum whenever that is held.
My central proposition today is that Euroscepticism in the UK media has largely, but not exclusively, been press-led, and that it's both increased in scale and intensity, particularly since the 1990s. The content and agenda-setting functions of UK media Euroscepticism have strongly influenced the ways in which UK politicians both think about what's achievable in their European policy and also how they think about what's desirable in their European policy as well. And I've got 4 sets of remarks briefly, followed by some conclusions. The first set of remarks is on definitions, and I've got 2 minutes for this. I like a challenge. At the time of joining in 1973, there wasn't such a thing as Euroscepticism, certainly not in the multifaceted way that we might understand it today. There was cross-party opposition, and there was a Labour Party in 1983 which advocated withdrawal, but there wasn't such a broad brush phenomenon as Euroscepticism, which mobilises opinion in the same way as today. So it became associated with political and media views in the mid-1980s, which doubted certain aspects, but not all aspects, of the core European integration project. This form of Euroscepticism crystallised during the 1990s around opposition to the extension of powers of the EU in the Maastricht Treaty, and it was particularly associated with the Conservative rebels under John Major, many of whom are still active today. So classic Euroscepticism has been associated with critics in the Conservative Party, but also in the media and elsewhere, who've rooted their opposition to the EU in arguments about 3 things. First of all, sovereignty. Secondly, free trade. And thirdly, the democracy accountability dimension of the EU. My second remarks are on the changing nature of this Euroscepticism. I think it's fair to say that, given this definition, Euroscepticism used to be the minority position in British politics and in the national conversation more generally. However, the British party system has changed. There's been the arrival of new parties, single-issue parties from the 1990s, Goldsmith's party and so on. So we have the rise of UKIP, populist movements against the EU as a form of governance, and Euroscepticism is increasingly drawn on these kinds of arguments and debates. And the EU has changed too. We have deeper integration across more policy sectors, we have more countries involved through enlargement, particularly the Big Bang enlargement, and we have changes to the EU constitution and the EU financial crisis more recently. So there are more opportunities to oppose the EU and more reasons for groups to emerge, develop and consolidate their opposition across various aspects of civil society. So the contestation around the European Union has changed quite dramatically. Now, what's all this meant for the UK media? We can have a look thirdly at patterns in media coverage. I think it's fair to say that Euroscepticism started life as a form of investigative reporting, both from Brussels and about the impact of EU policies on the consumers, etc., around the EU. So Andrew Neil's work at the Sunday Times might be a good example of this. And yet gradually, from the Thatcher years on, not just with the Bruges speech, but that's now drawn upon as some sort of origin, perhaps falsely, but I think it's relevant here. From the Thatcher years, the later Thatcher years, Euroscepticism became mainstreamed. And by this, we mean that the forms of Euroscepticism we see today became yoked to pre-existing narratives about the inevitable superiority of British policies and politics, and also a deep suspicion of the motives of EU partners. And you only need to look at the role that Germany plays as an other in much UK media coverage to see the ways in which this plays out. So some of the key changes in UK media patterns involve the increase in the volume of opposition to the EU that could be classified as Euroscepticism, and secondly, to an increase in the intensity of that Euroscepticism. And I'm rather taken by a quote from Raphael Baer, who says that hardly anyone likes the EU as much as the haters hate the EU. And I think that that says something about the way in which changing media patterns have reflected this deepening hatred for the EU on the sceptic side. So what we've had finally is a hardening of battle lines, which have made a nuanced and balanced debate increasingly difficult in UK press and civil society and wider media circles. And this leads to my fourth set of remarks on media and policy challenges, which I know are going to be taken up later on in the day as well. Politicians, if they ever could, certainly can't now ignore UK media Euroscepticism in both the making and the selling or the framing of their European policy. The New Labour years are a classic example, and almost all of the New Labour diarists, from Alistair Campbell down, stress how important the role of appeasing Murdoch and dealing with the right-wing sceptics was for Tony Blair and other European policymakers. So what we have here is a sense in which media moguls, like Rupert Murdoch, have lobbied hard to influence politicians. John Major's testimony at the Leveson inquiry was very good at spelling out the ways in which Murdoch was very clear to him, albeit not in forms of a threat, but in terms of encouraging him to change his European policy to keep the backing of the Murdoch press for the Conservative Party. During the New Labour years, Murdoch was very keen to influence key journalists and key headlines in influential papers like The Sun. Murdoch was constantly wanting to put the word traitor in headlines to do with Blair when it involved what he considered a transfer of powers to Brussels, etc. So the press in particular has performed a vital agenda-setting function for the wider broadcast and online media, and I think that those issues are also being unpacked elsewhere today. So what's key about this is that the readership numbers in the press in the UK who are getting daily Eurosceptic messages or more oppositional messages to the EU compared to pro-European messages is about 8-1 in terms of readership numbers, and this suggests a lack of balance in the debate. I'll just conclude with three remarks and then I'll wrap up. First of all, I think it's fair to say that Euroscepticism used to be the minority position, and now it's the mainstream interpretation in the UK of what goes on in the EU. It's almost impossible today as a politician to talk about the EU. You have to say reformed EU. There is no such thing as an EU in the UK anymore. It's a reformed EU, or else it doesn't exist. Secondly, this form of Euroscepticism does combine a sophisticated analysis of the failings of EU governance in areas of the reporting, and it also wraps this up with a series of identity concerns about the demise of Britain as an international actor, and it's now, of course, being linked to immigration and the control of borders, and this is perhaps the fundamental challenge that Cameron faces in selling his renegotiation package to us. And thirdly, I think it's also fair to say that a positive vote for the British to stay inside the EU would occur despite the press and not because of it, in terms of numbers and the volume of coverage which is weighted towards sceptical opinion. And this should encourage the owners and political editors and journalists to ask themselves in the UK context if they really are giving the British public the opinions it wants to hear on the EU. Thank you very much.
I would like to use this opportunity to present some of the findings of a research project that looks into the way national parliaments communicate EU issues to their citizens. And the background of that is, if you allow me to quote Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, is that democratic legitimacy is not exhausted by providing government for and by the people. It also needs to be government of the people, which requires an identification with the political system and a sense of ownership. And if we look at the EU today, and especially at Euroscepticism and feelings towards the EU within Britain, we can see that this is exactly the problem with democratic legitimacy in the EU. There is a lack of a sense of ownership. And our assumption was that where national parliaments take up EU issues, debate them, make them accessible for their citizens, provide input on how European policies can or cannot affect domestic policies, that they can add at least to providing this sense of ownership, of making the European political system something of the citizens' own. So that is the background of the project. Now, the fundamental problem that parliaments face is, of course, is even if they do deliberate EU issues, even if they do engage in the scrutiny of European documents, the citizens very rarely get to see them to do that. So they are reliant on the media to make that connection between Parliament and the citizens. And this is where our project comes in. We investigated how domestic media, newspapers to quality newspapers, one tabloid, report on parliamentary engagement in EU affairs in 7 different member states. And I would like to share some of the results of that project with you with regard to the House of Commons. A first result is that the House of Commons is very well covered in the national media. But if we look a bit more closely at the content of that coverage, something that is really apparent in comparison to other member states, is that Parliament is very, very often mentioned in the media simply as a passive object. It is an arena where something happens, where, for example, the Prime Minister is making a speech. Or it is an institution whose rights and prerogatives in EU politics are being discussed, but it is not actually displayed as an active actor in EU politics. Something that is also very interesting is that in comparison to other member states' newspapers, the British press tends to focus on statements from MPs. One could call them statements, one could also call them sound bites. They play a much, much greater role in the British media than they play in other media. We also had a look at sort of the 20 most cited or quoted MPs that appear. And unfortunately, I can't show you the list, but you have to believe me and trust me that it is a list of the most outspoken Eurosceptics that you can find in the House of Commons. Very few of them are actually involved institutionally in European affairs, so very few of them are members of the European Scrutiny Committee, with the exception of William Cash, or have been chairs of a European committee. And what is also interesting, and I think this relates to the press's interest in mavericks, they're also, almost all of them, the top rebels in the Conservative Party. So with this focus on Parliament simply being an arena where someone who's really important does something in EU politics, or as a source for sound bites, how often does Parliament actually get featured as an active actor? How often are parliamentary activities in EU politics covered? And in fact, that is far rarer when it comes to the House of Commons than in other member states. And when we look at the different parliamentary activities that are being covered, then it comes as no surprise that plenary activities that take place on the floor of the House, are, of course, the most visible and the most reported on. So plenary debates play a huge role, but what is interesting, a far, far greater role is played by the results of parliamentary votes. So in almost 30% of all articles that deal with an activity, you will have a vote mentioned, but in a very, very small minority of those articles, there will also be a reference to the debate that led up to this vote. And therefore, there will be very, very few articles that tell readers the different sides of the debate and how that outcome came about. We also looked at the policy areas in which the House of Commons was active in European affairs and those that were covered by the articles. Again, interesting result compared to other parliaments. When the House of Commons is actually active and debates and scrutinises the whole range of EU issues, and there were, of course, issues that were more important than others, due to the crisis, due to the European Union bill, due to the referendum. However, it also covered intensively aspects of foreign affairs, of energy policy, of regional policy, of common agricultural policy and fisheries, of employment and social policy, of all the different ranges that you can find. But when you look at the articles that that report on the House of Commons in EU affairs, it is a very one-sided picture. Almost all of the articles focus either on institutional matters, that is the whole debate on the EU budget or the fiscal compact. They focus on crisis issues, or they focus on issues debated in the House of Commons that relate to domestic provisions on EU affairs. So, as I said, the European Union bill or the referendum. 49% of all articles that cover the House of Commons in EU affairs are on the latter, were on the European Union bill or the referendum, while all of the other areas that the House of Commons is also engaged in are basically neglected. Something that has come up before is also the sort of the negative context, the negative sentiment that accompanies articles, and that is also true for the way that the newspapers feature the House of Commons, and it is true to much greater extent for the House of Commons than it is, for example, for the German Bundestag, for the Assemblée Nationale, for the Polish Sejm, for the Spanish Congreso, and others. So we find far less simply neutral articles in the on the House of Commons, but we find a much, much larger percentage of articles that feature the House of Commons in a very negative context. And this is very pronounced in Britain compared to the others. So to wrap this up, on the one hand, the media do support the House of Commons in reaching the citizens, because the House of Commons is comparatively well reported on. It features very often in the news. However, if we look at it more closely, then we can see that there's an above average focus on the House of Commons in a very passive role, not sort of an active institution, and on sound bites, particularly sound bites from Eurosceptic MPs. Second, there is a focus on very specific topics such as the crisis or the referendum, while other EU issues that happen in the House of Commons are then completely neglected in the media. And finally, what we have found is clearly routine is boring, conflicts play a huge role in the media coverage, and bad news still seems to be good news. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I will speak to this piece of reportage which we did with I did with an Italian reporter called Cristina Marconi about a year and a half ago, and it was based on talking to journalists almost entirely. So that what came out of that is what they think is happening. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is happening, because journalists are just as bad as everybody else is knowing what they're doing, but it is what they think is happening, and often I think it does actually happen. One of the, it's been covered already, is on Eurosceptic reporting in Brussels as a whole, among the the reporters, it's still a minority, still dominated by the UK, traditions set essentially in the 1980s, powerfully driven by papers like The Sun when Calvin Mackenzie was editing it, and the Daily Telegraph when Boris Johnson was the Brussels correspondent at a young age. And many people think of Boris Johnson as the kind of the Eurosceptic, the man who put the spine into Eurosceptics. He was the favourite, it was said, reporter of the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, and wrote stories which were regarded by many as very, very good stories, and by many of his colleagues and by the press officers in Europe as rubbish. They were quite often wholly wrong, but they were very vigorous, and they had an effect. They had an effect in Denmark, because he wrote a story saying that Delors was in a power grab to take over the leadership of Europe just before there was the vote on the Danish referendum, I think. And the referendum went very narrowly against, and Boris credited himself and was credited by others as having had the effect he did. He was followed by a number of others from the Telegraph. In some ways, the most interesting was a man called Bruno Waterfield, who now works for the Times, who it was felt with Boris, and I think possibly he felt himself, that it was kind of virtual. You know, nobody quite knew if he was taking it seriously, which still goes on about most of the positions he takes. But with Waterfield, he was much more a convinced Eurosceptic, and gave it a kind of underpinning that Boris lacked. Although obviously he became less. He didn't become as famous. I think that, as last speaker was saying about Euroscepticism spreading, it is still true that it's a majority by circulation anyway, not among the elite, but by circulation in the UK it's a majority. But the Euroscepticism that's leapt up in the last few years in Europe generally has often been more vicious than The Sun and the Mail and others. If you read the Italian right-wing press, the Giornale, which is the Berlusconi family paper, the Greek, the amount of anti-German bile and the identification of Chancellor Merkel with Nazism, quite explicitly, with swastikas all over the place, then you see something which actually is rare in British Euroscepticism, a much more direct hatred. One could almost call it racist, although I don't know if it's possible to be racist about Germans. At least it's not thought to be possible, and it's extreme. So Euroscepticism, I think, is now spreading far beyond among the UK. Well, one of the reasons why people feel that they don't own Europe, the European Commission, the European Parliament, is that news desks, it's a very hard sell for journalists to get stories in from Brussels. Not, again, in the elite papers like the FT, the Economist and others, but very, very difficult in other papers indeed. It's got to be a scandal, at least in the UK, less so in Germany. I mean, Germany, I think of all, if I don't read German, I'm told that German papers like the Frankfurter Allgemein and the Süddeutsche Zeitung have much more coverage, and also do the public service broadcasters have much more coverage than others. General coverage, not just about Germany, but for most people, most reporters, the story is what's the European Union doing for us, the Italians, the French, the Dutch, whatever it might be. That's the story, and the general picture is left, as again I say, to the elite. Also found that many of the correspondents there, when we were doing it, of course they were writing much more or broadcasting much more because it was a European crisis, but they found it very difficult to get hold of because it was technical, it was highly technical, Many of the issues, discussions, debates, even statements on the Euro crisis were hard to understand for general reporters, and most of the reporters there, really from everywhere, were not financial or economic reporters. The ones who were best served by colleagues back home who did understand what was happening were okay. But many of them, especially, of course, the ones who, in a sense, needed it most, like the Greeks, which had a tiny representation in Brussels, the Poles, generally the former communist countries who had one at most reporter there, sometimes none. They had their audiences had a real need of explanation, but very often could not get it. And the man from Exeter, the main Polish paper, said he was working 20 hours a day, trying, not just writing, but trying to understand what was happening, so to convey to his readers some sense of the reality. All politics is national, really, and that I think is one of the reasons why most of the audiences don't get the kind of information that would be needed so that to understand Europe as a whole. Many reporters thought that once you had a large Eurosceptic element in the Parliament after the last Euro elections, the thing would brighten up. There'd be more House of Commons type debate. Nigel Farage would cause more scandals, be rude to more people, and it would feature more on television. That, I think, I stand to be corrected, I don't think has happened all that much. It possibly has happened, but it hasn't really mattered too much. People don't see the European Parliament, with some justice, as mattering all that much. It's true, I think, that in the early days, the early years of the coverage of the European Union, the correspondents who went there, including those from Britain, like Dick Leonard from The Economist, I think then, were fans. They were for, one of the reasons they wanted to go there, or indeed were sent there, was because they liked the idea of Europe and wrote into it. They wrote for it as well as about it, and that has changed quite a lot. There's a greater amount of what one might call proper skepticism, not Euroscepticism, but proper skepticism. Journalism has to be skeptical. In other words, you have to say, is this man or woman telling the truth or lying? You have to check. And there's much more of that proper skepticism rather than following the line which is put out by Brussels. There still is some following of the line put out by Brussels, but if you talk to European press officers, they will very often, especially those who have been there for some time, be nostalgic about the good old days when press releases were more or less reproduced. One also found, end with this, that a certain amount of nostalgia among the press corps, especially those who are the most passionate pro-Europeans. The attempt to make an all-European newspaper or coverage of some kind. There's The Economist, there's the FT, there's Reuters and other news services. As I say, the Germans are said to be much better at covering the whole. But the one that actually has tried recently is American, Politico, which was the inside Beltway Washington newspaper come website, and it's now moved to Brussels. Whether or not it's succeeding, I don't know. It's quite good if you want to read it, but I don't know how successful it's very successful. It's very successful in Washington. I don't know how successful it is being in Washington. In Brussels. I'd imagine not all that much. The difficulty remains that press coverage is relentlessly national, except where it's dealing with people who have to know the whole story. Business people, politicians, scholars, and others who want a general picture. But that's a small audience, and it's well served. It's very well served, not just by these publications, but by many newsletters and magazines and so on, who make it their business to get down to the granular level. But apart from that, the large mass of people get, if they get anything, get what does it mean for you? And sometimes, as in the UK, the answer is not very much, and that's bad for you.